Good afternoon. Thank you very much to IDC and Professor Mintz for inviting me to speak. I'm very excited to be here. I want to really address three topics very briefly. Number one, why is Iran negotiating? Why have we seen a different approach from Tehran in the last year or so? Before, when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was president, Iran pursued a policy of resistance on the nuclear program. But Tehran's attitude has really changed. What are the reasons for this? Number two, what are the incentives for Iran to negotiate and reach a compromise? Because I do believe that Iran has plenty of incentives to reach an agreement on the nuclear program. And lastly, what can we expect from Iran if there's a nuclear deal? What kind of foreign policies will Tehran pursue? And what can President Rouhani do in terms of domestic politics? Can he reform Iran? Is he a reformist? And how much power will he have to change the country? Since the Geneva Agreement, the Joint Plan of Action, we have seen a different policy from Tehran. We've seen a very discernible shift in Iran's nuclear policy, and I think it's indicative of Iran's eagerness for a deal on the nuclear program. When Ahmadinejad was president, there wasn't a lot of movement. His negotiators didn't take the negotiations seriously. Their interlocutors kept complaining that Iranian negotiators kept giving speeches instead of being willing to negotiate. And essentially what has happened since Rouhani became president, even really before after that, was a consensus within the Islamic Republic, within the establishment, that the regime faced the deepest crisis it has faced really possibly in the last 3 decades, since the Iran-Iraq War of 1980 to 88. And there are two major reasons for this. There was an internal crisis, deep divisions within Iran, and there was an external crisis involving Iran's relations with the outside world and Iran's economy. In terms of internal instability in Iran, one of the major factors was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Iran's president before Rouhani. I believe, and a lot of Iranian politicians argue this as well, including Rouhani, that Ahmadinejad was just a disaster, not just for Iran, but for the Islamic Republic as a whole. He was a divisive figure. He was a poor manager. He had no understanding of economics. His policies were based on rhetoric and ideology rather than thought-out policies and diplomacy. And for years, people like Rouhani and his supporters, such as the former president Ayatollah Rafsanjani, complained about Rafsanjani's approach. And of course, during Ahmadinejad's presidency, he was very much supported by Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, and the Revolutionary Guard, especially the 4 years, 2005 to 2009, his first term. He was heavily backed by the establishment because he was deferential to Khamenei. He made a lot of Guards members very wealthy, and so he had their support. And the 2009 elections were a disaster for the regime and a disaster for Ayatollah Khamenei. They really did bet on the wrong horse. First of all, the elections were widely perceived as being fraudulent within Iran. And the Islamic Republic is not a democratic system as we have in the Western world. It doesn't even approach that. But because it is a republic, it's an Islamic republic, there's a certain amount of respect shown for the people's vote. So they have to go through the motions, at least, of being a republic. And 2009 basically undermined the Islamic Republic's popular basis. And as you remember, millions of Iranians went into the street. Ayatollah Khamenei backed Ahmadinejad, and not only was the public dissatisfied with the system, there were major divisions within Iran. The centrists and the reformists on one hand, including Rouhani, and the more conservative figures on the other hand. And of course, Ayatollah Khamenei backed Ahmadinejad. And what did Ahmadinejad do in return? He undermined Khamenei. I won't go into the very details of what happened between Khamenei and Ahmadinejad, but the supreme leader learned that he had made a big mistake. And so Rouhani essentially was allowed to run by the regime to fix this big problem. The Guardian Council in Iran vetted and qualified 8 candidates. Rouhani was one of them. He was not necessarily favored by Khamenei or the Revolutionary Guards, as Mayor just said, but he was acceptable to the system. He is part of the national security establishment. He has worked with the Revolutionary Guards. He was a Supreme Leader's representative to the National Security Council, and he had, more importantly, negotiated with the Europeans on the nuclear issue. And in a lot of ways, Rouhani is Iran's greatest expert on nuclear negotiations. He's written an 800-page book on it. I recommend you don't read it because it's not the most exciting read, but he is an expert. He knows what he's talking about. And in addition to healing the wounds within Iran, Rouhani's mission has been also to decrease the Islamic Republic's isolation because the centrist camp, people like Rouhani, believe that the Iranian Revolution cannot last if Iran lives in isolation. And Rouhani himself does not believe in this concept of exporting the revolution. And the Supreme Leader and Ahmadinejad are different, but he thinks that the Islamic Republic has to build itself at home. And he has said that we have to decide as a regime what we want. Do we want to be a cause, or do we want to be a nation state? And I think Henry Kissinger has made a similar comment. So Rouhani is the regime's fixer. He is a capable manager, much more so than Ahmadinejad. And one of the reasons he's president is because he's acceptable to the system, and because Iranians voted for him. And it was a relatively fair and free election, if you want to call it that. Of course, such a thing doesn't really exist in Iran. But by Iranian standards, it was a relatively clean election. And Iranians voted for Rouhani because they didn't love him. They didn't really know him from before the election. But he was the best of the 8 candidates, or probably the least disastrous, potentially. And so they had really little choice but to vote for him and pin their hopes on him. And he has promised them a lot, including reaching a negotiated settlement on the nuclear program and lifting sanctions. So this is his mandate as president. Now, people in Washington and elsewhere have said, well, Rouhani doesn't make the decisions. It's Khamenei, the supreme leader. He is the master and Rouhani is his puppet. And that's not necessarily correct because the president does have power in Iran. But Rouhani couldn't have undertaken the current negotiations without Khamenei's support. And why has Khamenei supported him? Because he senses danger. He has learned that if there's an economic collapse in Iran, his regime might not survive. And as supreme leader, Khamenei has to make sure his supporters within the system are happy. The Revolutionary Guards officers who've made millions, if not billions, don't lose their money, that they can transfer their funds within Iran and, more importantly, take their funds outside of Iran. So sanctions created a lot of pressure on Khamenei, and I think this is why we see movement on the nuclear issue. Khamenei made a very telling speech after Rouhani's election and the negotiations in Geneva started, and he said, "We're adopting a policy of heroic flexibility," نرمش قهرمانه in Persian. And this doesn't mean that we are giving up our principles. This doesn't mean we're giving up our revolutionary goals. Our struggle with the United States is not over. And he used wrestling as an analogy. Wrestling is a very popular sport in Iran. And he said, the United States and Iran are still wrestling, but sometimes we have to be heroic and adopt different tactics in order to win the fight. And this is why we see the so-called heroic flexibility from Khamenei, which in reality is a retreat. It's not very heroic. It's retreat under pressure. And thus far, the Revolutionary Guards have gone along with Khamenei's approach. The head of the Revolutionary Guards, Ali Jafari, General Jafari, made a speech, and he said, we're worried about Rouhani, and we think he might sell out our national interests. But for now, we're going to be silent because the situation is so sensitive. And Ayatollah Khamenei's office has instructed Iranian media not to attack the Rouhani government. Yesterday, I saw a report that the Iranian Minister of Intelligence had visited the most hardline of the newspapers in Iran, and named Kayhan, and had told the editor of Kayhan to be quiet for now. So there is a directive from the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards to hold off on attacks on Rouhani until he achieves a deal on the nuclear program. In terms of what comes after a nuclear deal, what kind of Iran will we have? And I think this is a concern to all of us, because a nuclear deal will not automatically erase the policies that concern us the most from Tehran, whether it's supporting Hezbollah, the Bashar al-Assad regime in Syria, undermining U.S. interests in the Middle East broadly. Rouhani himself has said that he's going to pursue a different foreign policy than Ahmadinejad, in which Iran's isolation, especially in the region, is decreased. And Rouhani has said, I'm going to work within the framework of the Islamic Republic. I'm going to work within the ground rules set by Khamenei, the Supreme Leader. But there's still some wiggle room. I think there's a tendency to have gotten too used to Ahmadinejad's policies, which were pretty extreme even by Iranian standards. I think Rouhani has several goals in mind, and we've seen indications as the negotiations have continued. First of all, regionally, Rouhani wants to improve relations with Saudi Arabia. He believes that Saudi Arabia is a key to Iran's national security interests. Ayatollah Rafsanjani, who has good relations with the Saudis, and Rouhani has pretty good relations with the Saudis. He actually signed a security agreement with them when he was National Security Advisor, have said, we used to have good relations with Riyadh. Ahmadinejad ruined them, and so they're trying to make things better. Of course, the Saudis are deeply suspicious of Iran, no matter who is president, and the Revolutionary Guards may not like much improved relations with Saudi Arabia, particularly since the Revolutionary Guards are trying to thwart Saudi ambitions across the region, whether in Lebanon, Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, etc. But so far, Iran has improved ties with the smaller Gulf countries, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar as well to a certain extent. Of course, Oman, which served as a mediator between Iran and the United States during the secret negotiations between a nuclear deal. Iran also wants to improve relations with Turkey, which have deteriorated over Syria, and there's a lot of economic incentive for both Iran and Turkey to put aside some of their differences. Of course, not all of their differences. On the issue of Israel, the Rouhani government has changed its rhetoric. We don't see the denials of the Holocaust that we saw under Ahmadinejad. I would say actually that Rouhani and his foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, have a great public relations team, tweeting happy Rosh Hashanah greetings, giving money to the only Jewish hospital in Tehran. Overall, I think the Rouhani government knows that Iran's very harsh approach toward Israel harms its interests in general. That doesn't mean, though, we can see very fundamental changes on the issue of Israel because Ayatollah Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards drive Iran's regional policies, in particular toward Israel, and they are very much motivated by an ideological hostility toward Israel that I think is very deep-rooted and it's not going to change anytime soon. On the issue of the United States, again, I believe that Rouhani and Zarif want improved relations. There's a huge constituency in Iran for normalized relations between Washington and Tehran, as the IDC poll demonstrated. But I think even within the political system in Iran, people like Rafsanjani, Rouhani, the former President Khatami want improved relations. I do believe that normal relations between the United States and Iran could cause the downfall of the Islamic Republic, however. They could shake one of the foundations of the system, which is anti-Americanism. And ultimately, I do not think Ayatollah Khamenei will approve of a U.S. embassy outside of which thousands of Iranians will line up so they can move to the United States. I think this would be humiliating for the regime and confirm that as a political and ideological system, it is a failure. On domestic issues, there are two ways of looking at what Rouhani can achieve after a nuclear deal. He could become empowered by it and gain momentum and fulfill some of the promises he made to the Iranian people in terms of improving human rights, releasing political prisoners, loosening up restrictions on social media and the regular media. The trends so far have not been good in terms of domestic improvements in Iran. Executions are still very high. According to some reports, they have increased since Rouhani became president under a judiciary which he does not control. Iranians who have returned to Iran and were politically active before and after 2009 have been arrested. And the conservative establishment has warned Rouhani not to open up Iranian culture. And Rouhani has said it's not the role of the government to control culture and society. Ayatollah Khamenei has said, no, it is the role of government to control culture and society. And one of the reasons I don't think the regime wants normalized relations with the United States because this would open up Pandora's box. And the conservative establishment believes that even if you open up Iran a little bit, it would cause a flood, whereas Rouhani believes in an escape valve. So just to conclude, there are incentives for Iran to reach a deal. Yes, Iran wants a nuclear weapons capability to protect the regime, but ultimately, if the regime believes pursuing that capability would be its downfall, it's going to reconsider that capability. I think Ayatollah Khamenei is not willing to give up the entire program. Getting rid of uranium enrichment is unrealistic because that could be a worse political defeat than total economic embargo. But from the regime's perspective, if they can hold on to something in terms of the nuclear program and tell the Iranian people, we won. After 10 years of struggle, we won. And so your sacrifices were not for nothing. And if the regime saves face, I think there's potential for a final agreement. I don't think that final agreement will solve the overall problem, and the overall problem is the Islamic Republic that rules Iran. As long as that system rules Iran, the Iranian people will be repressed, and Iran will pursue regional policies that are detrimental to U.S. and allied interests. Thank you.